black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed.
Hey, and welcome to Finlos Reads. This episode was inspired by a conversation I had with a good friend of mine, Naeem. We were in our regular group chat a few days back and discussing what he should read next, and my suggestion was one of my favorites. It's from the series of books by Stephen King called Dark Tower, the first of which is titled The Gunslinger. Now, it is kind of difficult to talk about The Gunslinger outside of the context of its greater body of work within the Dark Tower series, but The Gunslinger is an excellent novel on its own. So I'm going to spend some time today talking about what I like about it, what I think it does particularly well, what are some of its weaknesses, and why it makes for just an overall excellent novel by itself, as well as an introduction to a larger series of books. As we were having this conversation, Naeem was also in the midst of listening to a dramatization of The Lord of the Rings, and it's actually appropriate because one of the major inspirations that Stephen King had when writing The Dark Tower, or at least coming up with the ideas for The Dark Tower, was of course The Lord of the Rings. The larger narrative of the Dark Tower series functions in very much the same way as The Lord of the Rings. You have a hero on a very long journey from point A to point B to do a very specific task at a very specific place. It's a simple narrative. It's one that is common and it's classic in its archetypes. And of course, that's what makes it function so well, is that it's following a structure that we are very familiar with. What's really neat about The Gunslinger is that it takes this very same structure, this point A to point B, very specific and focused goal, and shrinks it down to a single narrative focused on a very limited number of characters. What's cool about this is that King is really setting up in the very beginning exactly what this series is about. No matter how complicated it gets, no matter how much gets layered on top, and no matter how many amazing, wonderful, and exciting events and conflicts and characters and places that get layered on top, and there are tons. I mean, there are, 8 books worth of content here. Everything always simplifies down to this very simple idea. It is the gunslinger, and he has his quest. And that's the story. And for some, that's too simple, and I get that. I think that it's not a hard story or a complex story, and it's certainly not an original story. Like I said, it is Lord of the Rings with a Western/sci-fi twist. But what Stephen King is really good at is taking things that we're comfortable with, things that we're familiar with, ideas and tropes and genres, and building new things from this. And of course, most modern authors do this, whether we're talking about the Harry Potter series, which pulls from everything, George Lucas, who stole from the classic Japanese samurai films and mixed them with the chivalrous knights of the Middle Ages. I mean, this is what our favorite creators do. They take the things that we're familiar with and they rebuild them. They break them down. They find the parts that work the best and they construct new and amazing things with them as a backbone while layering their own flavors on top. And I think that is what the Gunslinger does. It presents us with this very basic structure. And that structure is a primer for what you're going to be experiencing for the entire course of the Dark Tower series. And of course, the further into it you get, some of the waters get fairly muddy. We come to learn that as he's writing, he realizes, hey, why not make all of my books that I've ever written part of this larger meta universe, which is really cool. And I appreciate that Stephen King has managed to find a framework in which all of his books and stories can exist together. I think that is really cool that the monster in it is a component of the Dark Tower, and the human characters from Salem's Lot show up later on in the Dark Tower series. And I'm not going to give too much away from the future, because if you like these books, and I want you to read them. But I'm going to really focus now on what I love about the Dark Tower. Stephen King wrote a book about writing called On Writing, and he discussed a bit, and if you've never read this book and you're curious about his writing process or about how he suggests that you should go about your own writing practice, I suggest the book. It's a really good read. But Stephen King's method for writing fiction is to have a character who has a very specific quality or element about them, and put them in a very specific place or location, and see what happens, and press play, and basically see how they work themselves out of that situation. And you build your narrative from that sort of tension, that conflict that is inherent in whatever that constructed moment is. And I find that really interesting as a writer, because, you know, every writing instructor has a different methodology for how they suggest that you go about it. But this seems like a very practical method for me. And so you can imagine, and Stephen King has talked about this for his inspiration for the protagonist of the Dark Tower series and the Gunslinger, is the Gunslinger himself. Roland is inspired, at least in a very superficial sort of way, upon the stereotypical Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood gunfighter from the spaghetti westerns, right? This grizzled, lean, tall, blue-eyed, not gonna say very much, just gonna quick draw and solve the problem and leave town. And that is Roland at first glance. The other source of inspiration for the Gunslinger, and really for the Dark Tower series as a whole, is the romantic poem Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning, which is sort of this farcical account of a character on a quest to the Dark Tower. And so a lot of that is actually found throughout the course of both the Gunslinger and the rest of the Dark Tower books as a whole. So it's interesting to sort of read that poem and combine it with the image of Clint Eastwood, and that is your Roland. What happens when you take that guy, that Western gunslinger type character, and you put him in a different universe where the rules of the universe itself are starting to fail, to use King's language, where the world has moved on. And this world, of course, has similarities with our own world. They speak a variation of English. There's pop culture references like Hey Jude from the Beatles. They have references to Christianity. I think they call him the man Jesus. So like it's like the world just next door to ours. But what happens when you take that Clint Eastwood-esque gunslinger character and put him in this just different enough world and give him a quest, give him a mission? And that is the Gunslinger. And it's a really interesting way of going about exploring a character, because when we first meet Roland, the Gunslinger, he doesn't say much. He is in the desert. He is pursuing the man in black, and he needs to rest. And he happens upon this hut in the middle of nowhere, and we know he is dangerous. We know that this man who he encounters knows that he's dangerous. And so it's a mystery. And that is what makes it so cool, is that we want to know, why is Roland chasing the man in black? Why is this other character so nervous around Roland when he just showed up? what is the significance of him being called Gunslinger? It's not just like what we would call a Western, sheriff or whatever you want to say. It's a title, and we want to know why. And that is where Stephen King shines, because right then the book transitions to flashback, and we get to see why people are nervous around Roland. But not just nervous because he's terrifyingly good with his guns, but because he has purpose and he has drive, and there is nothing that is going to stand between him and his goal. And if that's your character, then this story becomes, what are the barriers that are going to come between him and the goal? And what are the links to which this person is going to go through to knock down those barriers to get to his goal? And that is exciting. That is an incredibly powerful way of telling a story. Now, again, it's not that simple. It wouldn't be interesting if it was that simple, because of course things get complicated. If it's just Roland and the Man in Black, it doesn't really matter what comes between them. It's always just knock down the walls. But what happens when our almost single-minded central character becomes attached to something, or becomes concerned with something that he genuinely cares for, so that now his desire becomes complicated, because now it's just not me and the pursuit. Now it's me and the pursuit with somebody else. And that very simple complication really changes the dynamic of the narrative, and the exploration of how that relationship modifies the character, and how the dynamic changes in terms of how the gunslinger then has to problem solve is really interesting. And then as the book continues and as the series continues, we come to learn that's what this is all about. It is, how do relationships complicate us? Because life is simple if we live for a purpose, and that's it. Like, that's easy. And so that is what I really think Stephen King does so well, to get back to my initial point of this, and what makes The Gunslinger such a great sampling of what the series is about, but just as a great novel and as a great piece of writing, is that Stephen King understands that relationships complicate us, and the need to exist outside of our own personal frame of reference makes us better people. And as you read in this book, we don't always do that, and then there are consequences for when we don't do that. And I think that that's fantastic. I think that is such a powerful tool and such a powerful thing to gain from such a simple story. It is a truly simple story, but one that is ripe with that exploration of personal growth and discovery of who we are by means of how we exist with others, when for so long we feel like all we've had to exist for was ourselves. So, Naeem, I hope you have fun. And if you are interested in The Gunslinger, or if you have a need for a new connected universe to read that you would like to, I highly suggest the Dark Tower series. I might now just have to go into all of these books in this Finlos Reads series. Over time, I couldn't do it all in a run because it's so much, but this genuinely makes me want to read The Gunslinger again, so maybe I'll go ahead and do that. But I hope that you've enjoyed this introduction to either Stephen King or The Dark Tower or The Gunslinger in general. I don't think that you need to read entire body of publications as a connected universe. I think that there are times when he tries to do that it doesn't work. But as an interesting thought experiment, I think that he does a very good job of making the argument for why that is an interesting way of going about writing one's stories. If you have any questions about writing, the writing process, the Gunslinger, or anything else that might have sparked your interest in this episode, please feel free to contact me so that I can feature you on a future episode. Thanks for listening to this episode, and I look forward to our future conversations.